Was Atari just a game or a name etched in the memory of a generation? In this video, let's take a look at the history of Atari. I'm Art of BT, always the best for you. Part 1, the beginning of electronic play. To understand Atari, you have to understand the moment that produced it. The early 1970s in Northern California were defined by a peculiar collision of counterculture and engineering culture. The same geographic corridor that had nurtured Hewlett-Packard and Fairchild Semiconductor was also producing communes, underground newspapers, and a philosophical rejection of corporate America's post-war orthodoxy. These two worlds were not, as it turned out, entirely incompatible. Nolan Bushnell was not a typical entrepreneur. He was a former carnival barker with an engineering degree from the University of Utah, a man who understood, intuitively, the psychology of attraction and compulsion. He had encountered an early computer game, Space War. During his time at university, running on a DEC PDP-1 that cost roughly the equivalent of a small house. His insight was not technical. It was commercial. He understood that if you could make a machine that delivered something like that experience cheaply enough, and put it somewhere people already gathered, they would feed it quarters indefinitely. His first commercial attempt, Computer Space, arrived in 1971 through a partnership with Nutting Associates. It failed commercially, not because the concept was wrong, but because the execution demanded too much of the average player. Bushnell drew the correct lesson: complexity was the enemy of adoption. In June 1972, Bushnell and his partner Ted Dabney incorporated Atari Incorporated, named after a term from the ancient board game Go. They hired a young engineer named Alan Alcorn and tasked him with building a training exercise, a simple table tennis simulation. The exercise became a product. The product became Pong. Pong was not the first video game. This distinction matters, and it is frequently misrepresented. What Pong was, what made it historically significant, was the first commercially successful mass-market arcade video game. It succeeded where Computer Space had not because it was, as Bushnell had demanded, simple enough that you could understand it without instruction, and compelling enough that you wanted to play it again. The first Pong cabinet was installed at a bar called Andy Capp's Tavern in Sunnyvale, California, in late 1972. Within weeks, it was reportedly malfunctioning, not from defect, but because the coin mechanism had jammed from an overflow of quarters. The signal could not have been clearer. Atari moved quickly. The company established manufacturing, expanded its sales force, and began defending its intellectual territory against competitors who saw the same opportunity. In the process, Atari helped create something that had not previously existed: a commercial video game industry, with supply chains, distribution networks, retail relationships, and competitive dynamics. The arcade era that followed was not simply entertainment. It was the first test of market mechanics for interactive electronic media, questions of hardware standardization, software differentiation, consumer price tolerance, and operator economics that would recur, in evolved forms, for the next 5 decades. Part 2, the explosion. The arcade business was profitable. It was not, however, scalable in the way that would make Atari truly significant. Arcades required physical locations, operator relationships, and machines that cost hundreds or thousands of dollars. The real opportunity, the one that would determine Atari's place in history, was the living room. The concept of a home console was not Atari's invention. Magnavox's Odyssey, released in 1972, had demonstrated that television-based interactive games could be sold to consumers. What Atari understood, more clearly than its competitors, was that a home console needed to be a platform, not a fixed-function device, but a machine that could run multiple games delivered as interchangeable cartridges. The Atari 2600, released in 1977 under the original name Atari Video Computer System, was this insight made hardware. It was not the most powerful machine possible. It was designed to a price point that made it accessible to middle-class American households. It used an MOS Technology 6507 processor and contained 128 bytes of RAM. Figures that today seem almost comically constrained, but in 1977 represented a careful and commercially conscious engineering trade-off. Initial sales were modest. The 2600 was not an overnight success. Atari spent heavily on marketing and faced competition from Mattel's Intellivision and a crowded field of imitators. The company was also carrying substantial debt from its manufacturing build-out. Then, in 1980, Atari secured the home license for Space Invaders, Taito's massively successful arcade phenomenon. Console sales quadrupled. The 2600 was now not just a product, it was the destination for the arcade experience at home. For millions of American households, the Atari 2600 was synonymous with video games in the same way that Xerox was synonymous with photocopying or Kleenex with facial tissue. By this point, Atari was no longer an independent company. In 1976, Bushnell had sold Atari to Warner Communications for $28 million, retaining a leadership role but ceding majority ownership and, ultimately, strategic control. This transaction was the pivot point around which Atari's entire subsequent history would rotate. Warner Communications brought capital and distribution infrastructure. It also brought an entirely different institutional philosophy. Warner was a media conglomerate built on intellectual property, contractual relationships, and quarterly performance metrics. Atari's founding culture, freewheeling, engineering-driven, tolerant of chaos and experimentation, was now embedded inside an organization that operated by fundamentally different rules. By 1980, Atari was generating approximately $2 billion in annual revenue and represented roughly a third of Warner's total revenues. The pressure to sustain this performance was enormous. And the methods used to sustain it would set in motion events that could not be reversed. Part 3, Chaos Inside the Empire. There is a detail about the Atari 2600 that illuminates everything that followed. The games, dozens of them, eventually hundreds of them, were written by software engineers employed by Atari. These engineers were given no royalties. Their names did not appear on the cartridges they created. Atari's corporate position, inherited from the Warner era's instinct toward IP control, was that games were proprietary products of the company, not credited creative works of individual authors. Consider what this meant in practice. A programmer named Warren Robinette spent months alone building Adventure, one of the first games to feature a persistent world, hidden rooms, and an inventory system. The game sold approximately 1 million cartridges. Robinette received his salary. His name appeared nowhere on the product. In a now famous act of covert authorship, Robinette embedded a secret room into the game that displayed his name, the first known Easter egg in video game history. He hid his own identity inside his own creation because the company had made his authorship invisible. This was not an isolated grievance. It was systemic. A group of Atari's highest-performing game developers, including David Crane, Alan Miller, Bob Whitehead, and Larry Kaplan, approached management in 1979 with documented evidence that their games accounted for a substantial share of the company's revenues. They requested royalties and on-box credit. The request was refused. They left. In 1979, they founded Activision. This was not merely a personnel departure. It was a structural rupture. Activision became the first third-party video game developer in history, a company that would produce software for the Atari 2600 without Atari's permission or partnership. Atari attempted to sue Activision into non-existence. The lawsuit was ultimately settled, with Activision paying licensing fees to Atari, an outcome that, paradoxically, legitimized the very third-party development model Atari had sought to destroy. The consequences were irreversible. Once third-party development was legally established, the floodgates opened. Hundreds of companies began producing cartridges for the 2600. Many of these companies had minimal development expertise, limited quality control processes, and a singular focus on capitalizing on a market that appeared, from the outside, to be entirely without ceiling. This is the first mechanism of the collapse, the externalization of software production without quality gatekeeping. Atari had accidentally created an open platform while attempting to maintain a closed one. The market flooded with product. At the same time, Atari's internal dynamics were deteriorating. Bushnell, increasingly at odds with Warner's corporate management style, was ousted as chairman in 1978. The rotating cast of executives that followed lacked both his product instincts and his understanding of what the gaming audience actually valued. Decisions became driven by revenue forecasting rather than product quality. Manufacturing commitments were made based on sales projections that assumed a market that would continue to grow indefinitely. Markets do not grow indefinitely. Part 4, the 1983 crash. By 1982, the signs were present for anyone willing to read them. The home video game market had attracted not just software developers but retailers who had loaded their shelves and warehouses with inventory on the assumption that consumer demand was inelastic. There were, by various estimates, between 500 and 1,000 game titles available for the Atari 2600 by the end of 1982. Consumer confidence in any individual title was, rationally, collapsing. If 9 out of 10 games were poor, the rational response was to stop purchasing games on the basis of name alone. Trust in the category was eroding. This dynamic was not unique to video games. It follows a recognizable pattern in emerging markets where low barriers to entry, combined with speculative investment, produce oversupply before quality signals develop. The consumer cannot distinguish signal from noise. Purchasing behavior becomes conservative. Revenue falls. Into this environment, Atari delivered two products that became historical symbols, though their actual causal weight in the crash is more complicated than popular memory suggests. The first was the home port of Pac-Man. Atari paid approximately $12 million for the license and manufactured roughly 12 million cartridges for a 2,600 user base of approximately 10 million consoles. The economics alone were aggressive. The product itself was widely criticized as technically inferior to the arcade original, the ghost characters rendered in a way that required an unusual flicker effect, the audio a pale approximation of the original's distinctive sound design. Atari had manufactured more copies than there were consoles capable of running them. The returns were substantial. The second product was the 2600 adaptation of E.T. the Extraterrestrial, based on Steven Spielberg's 1982 film, then among the highest-grossing films in history. The game was developed by a single programmer, Howard Scott Warshaw, in approximately 5 weeks, a timeline compressed by Atari's desire to meet the 1982 holiday season. The game that resulted was, by nearly all contemporary and retrospective accounts, poorly designed, a series of pits from which the player character could fall repeatedly, game mechanics that provided insufficient feedback or satisfaction, and objectives that were unclear without a manual that many players did not have. E.T. has since become the most cited example of Atari's collapse, the game so bad it crashed the industry. This framing is compelling. It is also an oversimplification. The market was already contracting before E.T. reached shelves. The underlying causes: overproduction, quality collapse, erosion of consumer trust, and a retail system that had dramatically overcommitted to inventory, were structural, not attributable to any single product. What E.T. represented was not a cause but a symbol, the endpoint of a pattern in which commercial pressure consistently overrode product quality, in which timelines compressed past the point of adequate development, in which the short-term accounting logic of quarterly revenue overwhelmed the long-term logic of category health. The financial consequences were rapid and severe. In December 1982, Warner Communications announced that Atari's annual profits would be significantly below projections. Warner's own stock fell 35% in a single day. The broader market for video game companies contracted sharply. Retailers, holding enormous inventories of unsold product, began deep discounting and ultimately returning merchandise. Coleco, Mattel Electronics, and dozens of smaller software publishers reported similar crises. By 1983, the North American video game market had contracted from approximately $3.2 billion in 1983 to roughly $100 million by 1985, a collapse of more than 97% in retail value within 2 years. It was one of the most rapid market contractions in consumer electronics history. Part 5: Aftermath and Reinvention. In 1984, Warner Communications divided Atari into component parts. The home computer and console divisions were sold to Jack Tramiel, the founder of Commodore Business Machines, who acquired them for minimal capital consideration but substantial assumed liabilities. The arcade division was spun off separately and eventually dissolved. Bushnell, who had been removed from the company he founded years earlier, was not part of the restructuring. Tramiel's Atari pursued a different strategy. The Atari ST personal computer, released in 1985, offered 68,000 processor performance at a price point significantly below Apple's competing products. In certain European markets, particularly the United Kingdom and Germany, the ST became genuinely successful, particularly among musicians, for whom Atari's built-in MIDI interface made it a preferred platform for sequencing and production software. This was not the mass-market resurgence that would have returned Atari to industry dominance, but it was a legitimate business, sustained for nearly a decade. Meanwhile, the event that would permanently reshape the video game industry arrived from Japan. Nintendo's Famicom, released in Japan in 1983 and as the Nintendo Entertainment System in North America in 1985, had been designed with the American market's failure specifically in mind. Nintendo's retail strategy was carefully constructed to avoid the perception that the NES was a video game system in the traditional sense. It was marketed initially alongside a toy robot and positioned partly as an entertainment system rather than a gaming console. More significantly, Nintendo implemented a licensing program that third-party developers were required to participate in. Only Nintendo-approved cartridges, identified by the official seal of quality, could function in the NES. This was enforced not by contract alone but by hardware. A lockout chip in the console rejected unauthorized cartridges. The open platform model that had flooded the 2600 with poor quality software was not replicated. Nintendo controlled quality at the gate. The NES succeeded where the 2600 had collapsed not because it offered dramatically superior technical performance to pre-crash consoles, but because it restored consumer trust in the category. By curating what appeared on the platform, Nintendo rehabilitated the idea that a video game could reliably be a worthwhile purchase. Atari continued to make products throughout the late 1980s and into the 1990s, the Atari 7800, the Lynx portable console, and finally the Jaguar, marketed on release in 1993 as the first 64-bit gaming system. None of these products achieved the market presence needed to challenge Nintendo or, later, Sega. The Jaguar's commercial failure effectively ended Atari's relevance as a hardware manufacturer. The Atari brand itself has since passed through multiple ownership structures, acquired by Infogrames in 2001, rebranded, relaunched, reacquired. As of the 2020s, the Atari name persists primarily as a licensing property and nostalgic cultural signifier, with periodic announcements of new products and ventures that have consistently underdelivered against their stated ambitions. Part 6, The Pattern. It would be convenient to treat Atari's story as a cautionary tale about specific mistakes, the wrong product decisions, the wrong executives, the wrong timing. This reading is available in the historical record. It is also insufficient. What Atari's history actually describes is something more structural and more recurring. Consider the sequence: a new technology creates a new market. Early participants enjoy extraordinary growth because demand exceeds supply and competition is limited. Success attracts capital. Capital accelerates scaling faster than institutional capacity can handle. Scaling attracts imitators. Market floods with product of declining average quality. Consumer trust erodes. Market contracts sharply. The companies that survive are those that either implement quality controls or enter late enough to learn from the collapse. This sequence did not originate with Atari. It did not end with Atari. The dynamics that produced the 1983 crash, speculative overinvestment in a new technology category, the exploitation of creative labor without adequate compensation or credit, the prioritization of quarterly performance over product integrity, the assumption that exponential growth would continue past its structural limits, these are not period-specific failures. They are recurring features of how markets respond to new technology categories. The treatment of Atari's game developers, the refusal of royalties, the suppression of creative credit, the mass departure of talent, prefigured debates about creative rights and platform economics that would intensify with the rise of the internet, streaming platforms, and the app economy. The question of who owns value created by individuals working within corporate infrastructure remains unresolved, and the answers being negotiated now in digital markets are not fundamentally different from the ones being fought over at Atari in 1979. The 1983 crash itself became a case study used in business schools, a shorthand for the dangers of market saturation, and perhaps most productively a direct input into Nintendo's platform design philosophy. The lockout chip in the NES is, in a specific sense, a technological response to Atari's failure. Quality control as hardware architecture. The lesson learned by the next entrant. There is also the matter of Nolan Bushnell himself, a figure whose legacy resists easy categorization. He was, by most accounts, a genuinely visionary entrepreneur who understood what interactive entertainment could become before most of the world was capable of imagining it. He was also, by documented accounts, a chaotic manager who created a company culture that was innovative and ungovernable in roughly equal measure. The tension between creative vision and operational discipline that marked Atari's early years is a tension that recurs across the history of technology companies, sometimes resolved productively and sometimes catastrophically. Atari existed at the intersection of several tectonic shifts simultaneously: the rise of consumer electronics, the transformation of entertainment economics, the emergence of software as a standalone commercial product, and the earliest stages of what would become the personal computing revolution. It navigated none of these transitions with anything resembling grace. It did, however, clear the ground that others would build on. The industries that followed, personal computing, online gaming, mobile applications, streaming entertainment, inherited both Atari's innovations and its unresolved contradictions. The questions that surfaced about creative labor, platform control, speculative investment, and quality sustainability were not answered in 1983. They were merely inherited by the next generation of companies operating at larger scale with higher stakes. So the question that lingers, after the dust of the crash has long settled, after the cartridges have been excavated from New Mexico landfill sites and displayed in museums, after the nostalgia has been commercially harvested and the brand has been sold and resold and sold again, the question is this: was Atari a failure? In the narrowest financial sense, yes. It collapsed. It lost the market it created. The company that invented commercial video gaming did not ultimately dominate the industry it made possible. By any conventional measure of corporate success, the outcome was a failure. But there is another frame, one that is less emotionally satisfying and, perhaps for that reason, more accurate. Atari was a prototype. Not in the diminishing sense of something unfinished, but in the precise engineering sense, a first functional model that proves a concept, reveals the flaws in its own design, and provides the empirical foundation for what follows. Every technology industry since has operated through the same cycle: innovation, scaling, exploitation, collapse, recalibration. The variables change. The semiconductor may be different, the platform may be digital, the capital may be venture-backed rather than conglomerate-owned. But the structure persists. The developers who left Atari without royalties built the software industry. The consumers who stopped trusting the 2600 forced the platform controls that made Nintendo possible. The executives who drove Atari into the ground taught an entire generation of technology managers what not to do, though that lesson, like most structural lessons, has required repeated relearning. Atari did not fail. Atari was used up. There is a difference, and recognizing it tells you more about how markets actually function than any story about a single bad game ever could. Every disruptive technology company since has been Atari by another name, playing by the same rules, toward the same kinds of ends. The only real question was never whether it would happen. It was only ever, who learns from it?